Technology has a complex relationship with security. Technologies do improve security. I mean, an example would be fingerprinting technology, which made an enormous difference in crime fighting, or the invention of the radio, which fundamentally changed the way police operate. And the problem is that technologies work best when they serve people. Technology has a place in security, but security is never fundamentally about technology. Now, of course, people are going to use technology. Right? The police use technology. The Army uses technology. Computer security guys use technology. But technology works best when it doesn't try to substitute for people, when it tries to augment people. So technologies of investigation, of intelligence, are all real good. Static technologies, scanning people at airports, are much more easy to break because they aren't as adaptive. They aren't as resilient. They don't have the natural advantages that people do. And with people attacking, they're always going to win. Identification is fundamental to our species. We recognize our family, our friends, our associates. I mean, there's nothing weird about identification or identification-based security. The problems arise when you move it from the micro level, from the individual level, to a mass level. Because then it's not people recognizing people they know, it's systems trying to recognize people organically. And that's where the failures tend to arise. It's actually a very hard problem. You have to make something that can be produced in quantity reasonably cheaply. At the same time that it can't be forgeable even at great expense. And that's very hard to do. All ID cards are forgeable. It's a matter of cost. And sort of perversely, if you have an ID card that's very valuable, then it's more forgeable because the bad guy's willing to spend more money to forge it. So as you make an ID card more general purpose, more authoritative, more useful, you make it a more attractive target, which makes it more likely to be forged because it's more valuable once forged. I mean, there's lots of ways to game the ID system. Right? I mean, first of all, you can get a ticket and see if they'll issue you a boarding pass. Right? If they won't, you know you're on a list. You can apply for a clear card. And I think it's like $80 or $100 as a service to let you know if you're on the no-fly list. You can fly without an ID. Walk up and claim you've lost an ID. And you get secondary screening, but that's it. You can fly on someone else's boarding pass. Lots of ways to print boarding passes in someone else's name. They've been discussed endlessly. There are all sorts of ways to game the ID system. It doesn't actually work. So Real ID is an attempt to get a national ID through the driver's license system. So instead of there being one identification that everyone would get as a citizen of the United States, the federal government is trying to standardize state driver's licenses so they might look different, might have different pictures and different layouts. They would have the same data and the same databases behind it, allowing it to be effectively one national ID. Issuing a national ID is politically problematic. Whenever you poll people, they don't want a national ID. National IDs are never popular. And the only reason Real ID passed, it was slipped into a must-pass defense appropriations bill. So it passed without any political debate, without any hearings. It was kind of snuck in. If there were hearings, it never would have passed. So it was a way to sort of backdoor a national ID without engaging in the political debate. These cards have to be issued. There'll be issuance procedures. And these procedures will be based on other documents. You're going to walk up to some motor vehicles clerk and say, here's my documentation, give me a Real ID. So the security of the Real ID depends on the security of those breeder documents. Also depends on the integrity of that motor vehicles clerk who's going to issue the Real ID based on those documents. And we know these people make mistakes, and they also can be bribed. I mean, several 9/11 terrorists got legitimate Virginia driver's license in fake names because they bribed a motor vehicles clerk. It doesn't matter how good the ID card was. It doesn't matter how good the authentication procedures were. It doesn't matter how good the issuance procedures were. If the DMV clerk can be bribed, it all goes out the window. On the other side, this ID has to be verified. Right? At some point, you're going to show this real ID to a policeman, to a officer at an airport, and they are going to take that card and go into a database. There's some database that has all the information that's on the card, and that database is stored somewhere. Well, perversely, this all makes identity theft easier. Right? The Real ID database becomes a one-stop shop for identity thieves. And getting a real ID in somebody else's name suddenly becomes very, very valuable. So instead of having a distributed system, you might think of your wallet, where you have a bunch of credit cards, a bunch of IDs. If someone to impersonate you, they couldn't impersonate it all. They just do one or two things. Right? As Real ID subsumes all those other things, it's a much more attractive target. It's much more valuable once stolen, and a much more effective form of identity theft. One of the problems with ID cards is that when you talk about them, the actual card is just the tip of the iceberg. Right? The card is just a piece of plastic you carry in your wallet that has your picture, some information, some anti-forgery devices, but that's backed up by an entire system, an entire database system, an issuing system, a verification system, and the real cost in any of these ID programs, like Real ID, is not the piece of plastic, it's the whole system behind it. Real ID was written as an unfunded mandate. I mean, one of the ways it was snuck through Congress is it didn't have any budget attached. So it's an unfunded mandate on the states to update their individual driver's license issuance procedures to conform to this Real ID standard. And many states have rebelled and rejected this unfunded mandate. The problem with costing anything like Real ID is any number you hear is going to be a lie. We just don't know. So the latest number I've heard is $23 billion, but that's going to be nowhere near the actual cost. A lot of costs are hidden, and these sorts of big IT projects always overrun a lot. So whenever you hear these numbers, be real careful because they're not going to be accurate. It'll cost 4, 5, 10 times as much when all is said and done. So when you think about security of airplanes, right, there are several ways you can approach the problem, or at least a combination. You can prevent bad people from getting on airplanes. Right, think about ID checks or checks off a watch list. You can prevent bad things from getting on airplanes. Think of screening for guns and bombs. And you can prevent bad events from happening on airplanes. So things like sky marshals and reinforced cockpit doors. And those are the three basic ways you can look at airplane security. And of course, any security system is going to do a combination of those things. There's sort of a myth that we can prevent bad people from getting on airplanes. Right? There's the idea that we have this list of bad guys, the watch list, the no-fly list. And all you have to do is to make sure the passengers are not on the list, they can get on the plane. I mean, that really is a myth. Most bad guys aren't on the list. Right? Timothy McVeigh wasn't on the list. The Unabomber wasn't on the list. The DC snipers weren't on the list. Most 9/11 terrorists, most of the Palestinian suicide bombers, these people aren't on the list. And the idea that there's this list, doesn't make any sense. I mean, I don't think we really can hope to keep the bad guys off the airplanes. I regularly argue that two things we've done since September 11th have improved security. The first one is reinforcing the cockpit door, and the second one is convincing passengers they have to fight back. You can argue that sky marshals are also effective. That's the third one. But the sky marshals are effective more in idea than reality. All of those three measures focus on not keeping bad people off airplanes, not keeping bad things off airplanes, but keeping bad events from happening on airplanes. And that really is our best chance for security. things that are most effective and most cost effective.